We now return. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. So, witness, please state your name and occupation for the court. Eugene Mikodova, lecturer in forensic medicine at the Imperial Yume University in Tokyo, Japan. And Professor Mikodova, the young lady beside you is? This is Dr. Maria Gori. Scotland Yard's practicing coroner, the daughter of Dr. Scythe, I understand. Yes, Dr. Scythe. I'm afraid I can't tell you why she's here. She just appeared. You summon this strange Japanese man as a witness to the autopsy, but you don't summon Mama. That makes no sense. She was there too. That's about the size of it. I've had her eyes boring into the side of my cheek constantly, whilst I was in the antechamber too. Poor man. The idea of it's making me shudder. The revelations about Dr. Scythe that came to light some days ago defiled the reputation of the entire judiciary. She was therefore deemed unfit to appear as a witness in today's proceedings. The Ministry of Justice's decision on that is final. Well, we wouldn't want any more perjury to be committed, would we? The Ministry of Justice? Some questionable strings are being pulled, I think. I remember you, Dr. Mikodova, but I certainly never expected to be meeting you under these circumstances. Yes, it has been a long while, Lord Strongheart. The prosecution understands that you were a visiting student of forensic science in London until 10 years ago. That's right. I studied under Dr. Wilson at St. Sinner's. I saw you were present at the autopsy of my brother, Clint Van Zeeks. I was, yes. I assisted Dr. Wilson with the entire procedure. Mama is far more skilled than any Japanese man. Well, Dr. Wilson asked me to be his primary assistant on that occasion. This autopsy report was actually penned by you, I believe. Yes, I noted all of the doctor's findings, and when we were done, he read through the document and signed it. Oh, Mama. Second assistant, she wouldn't have had such a good view of all the innards. So, Professor, do you remember Inspector Gregson? Yes, of course. If it wasn't for his insistence, Lord Van Zeek's autopsy would never have happened. But he was absolutely convinced that it would reveal decisive evidence against Genshin, you see. So Lord Strongheart had to entreat the nobility to allow it to take place. Do correct me if I'm wrong, my lord. It was as a result of that autopsy that a mass murderer was apprehended and justice was done. But Gregson admitted it before he was killed. He admitted that the results of the autopsy were fabricated. You were there at the time. You must testify. You have an obligation to tell the truth about what really went on. Absolutely. That's precisely why I'm here. And that's why I'm here too. Very well then. We'll give your formal testimony now, witness. But before you begin, a word of warning. Oh, you'll state truthful and accurately what you saw and what you heard at the time. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise, my lord. The moment your testimony verges on supposition, I will expel you from the courtroom. Remember that. My own observations, I couldn't say there was any indication of the autopsy results having been fabricated. Death resulted from a wound made by a Western-style sword transfixing the heart. Western style. That I found a little strange. There were no other signs of internal injury. Nothing questionable at all. It was just that beautiful but dangerous piece of evidence removed from the man's stomach. Go on. Presumed to have been swallowed by the victim as a way of posthumously identifying his assailant. No indication? Nothing to suggest fabrication? Professor Mikotoba, are you certain about that? Well, nothing that I could positively identify as such, much less swear to in testimony. Oh, that clears things up nicely. The only fabrication here, Sogi, has come from you. What? I claim the inspector confessed just before his death, but that is the fabrication. No, he freely acknowledged it. I swear he did. Really, with the tip of a sword at his throat. The man was clearly at his wit's end. The court will give no credence to this confession that was uttered in obvious desperation. Quite simply, there was nothing questionable about the investigation of Lord Clint Van Zeek's death. With this testimony we have, without question, uncovered the whole truth of the matter. If I may, my lord, there was most certainly something questionable about it, and the whole truth does rather elude us, I feel. Beg your pardon. Well, you're obviously aware of the facts of the case. All 4 of the professor's previous victims died when an enormous beast was set upon them that ripped out their throats. Such horrifying crimes. But curiously, the killer's last victim, Lord Clint Van Zeek, suffered a different fate. Yes, you're right. He was stabbed through the heart with a sword. That's enough. I believe I warned you about this, witness. Promise to curtail your testimony as soon as it entered the realms of supposition or speculation. Very well, my lord. In that case, the defense will pursue a conclusion to this during the cross-examination. What? I have the right to cross-examine every witness after testimony. And I fully intend to exercise that right. Ryunosuke. I'm afraid that even the presiding judge has no authority to contravene the letter of the law, as I'm sure every member of the judiciary present in the gallery would agree. Very well, you may begin, counsel. However, the moment your argument strays from the established facts, I will not hesitate to bring the cross-examination to an end. Proceed with caution. Yes, my lord. Observations, there was no indication of odds as a result of it. Hold it! You couldn't say. No, sadly not. But then you couldn't say there wasn't any indication either, could you? No, true, I couldn't. I was at Dr. Wilson's side as he performed the procedure, recording what he did. But at times, of course, he instructed me to fetch implements and such like. Whilst I was away from the operating table, obviously I could have missed something. And at those times, what was the secondary assistant doing? Following this Japanese man's orders to adjust the lighting or pass him implements. But that doesn't mean Mama wasn't a vital part of the team. Quite, yes. So, would you kindly refrain from staring at my cheek like that? Professor Mikotoba, think, was there nothing at all that seemed out of place to you? Well, yes, there was, as a matter of fact. It resulted from a wound made by a Western forged sword. In all of the previous 4 killings attributed to the professor, the victims were killed by an enormous dog, I believe. Their throats were, well, mauled. So this has got to be the point where Sholmes shows up, right? The manuscript about the Hound of the Baskervilles that he had kept in the safe box or whatever. He's probably going to bring that up as his evidence when he comes back. Because that's like the one dangling storyline left over from the previous game. Correct, and yet Lord Van Zeeks was stabbed. Do you mean to say you think Lord Clint Van Zeeks may not in fact have been one of the professor's victims? There's no basis on which to doubt the findings of the investigations carried out at the time. But Ryunosuke confessed to all the crimes upon his arrest. He admitted to having taken the lives of all 5 members of the aristocracy. Yet the beast that was used to carry out the killings was never identified. No evidence was found to suggest that Genshin ever kept a dog. True hound of hell. I know the signs of internal injury.
Hold it!
But, you weren't actually present at the autopsy yourself, were you, Dr. Gory? Does that matter? Well, I, just wonder how useful your testimony can be in that case, really. I mean, it would be different if your mother, Dr. Scythe, were in the stands, but... I think I'll take a look at the case, and Mama's told me the story countless times. The statement I just made is exactly what's written in the autopsy report. I did confirm that myself at the time, it's true. Besides the stab wound, there were no other signs of internal trauma. Let's see. Mama told me all about it. No. She said there was nothing of note internally. But they did find an amazing piece of evidence. Something unbelievable. Unbelievable? What do you mean? Come on, Dr. Gory, what was it? It's just that beautiful but dangerous piece of evidence.
Hold it!
What exactly was it, though? What does beautiful but dangerous mean? Oh, it was sparkly and round with a hole, as if it might slip over a finger, perhaps. It was a ring belonging to Genshin Asogi. My father's ring? Was inside the victim's stomach? At the time, Genshin wore a large ring on the digitus quartus of his left hand, the 4th or ring finger. I'd understood it was some sort of keepsake. When my father left Japan for London 16 years ago, I was 8 years old, but I remember that ring. You do? My father's possessions were sent to our family home in Japan after his death, but the ring wasn't among them. Obviously not. It was a key piece of evidence. It remains under lock and key in the stalls at Scotland Yard to this day. After the autopsy, Genshin was summoned by the police to check for the presence of his ring. It wasn't on his hand, of course. Moreover, there were deep abrasions on his finger where it had been pulled off. They arrested the man there and then, right before my eyes. Could they? I brought the ring along with me today. What? There it is, a bit dusty from years in the stores. Good gracious, yes, that's it. I haven't seen that in 10 long years. And that was found inside the victim's stomach. Yes, I'm afraid so. You hesitated there, Professor Mikotoba. Could we read something into that? Well, it's just that, thinking back now, I didn't actually witness the moment it was extracted from the victim's body. Oh my, really? At the precise moment, Dr. Wilson had asked me to fetch him a new scalpel, you see. Dr. Gory, removal of historic evidence from the stores requires my consent, does it not? However it came to be here, the court cannot deny that this is crucial evidence for today's proceedings. Very well, you may submit it. Mr. Sogi's ring's been entered into the court record. It's not the sort of ring normally seen in Japan. They almost look like claws protecting that jewel. Let's peek. These fat claws are doing a good job of protecting the equally fat gemstone in the middle of this ring. Yes, if you were clumsy, you could give yourself a rather nasty cut on them, I should think. Ow. Now my finger's bleeding. The claws really are sharp. Oh my, that was very quick clumsiness, Mr. Naruhodo, even for you. Who would make such a dangerous ring? Be You couldn't swallow it without doing yourself some serious damage, surely. Well, there you go. A sticky mochi bun of about that size would go down much better with some red bean paste in the middle. Someone as clumsy as me would probably manage to choke on it somehow. There you go. You must examine it very carefully, Mr. Naruhodo. Very carefully indeed. Indeed. Presumed to have been swallowed by the victim posthumously. Hold it! And that was the decisive piece of evidence that led to Genshin Asogi's arrest. Correct. After further investigations by Scotland Yard, the man admitted to his crimes. It's a lie. My father was no killer. Varric Van Zeeks, it was you. You twisted the truth to suit your purposes. Your hatred for me doesn't change the facts that were established 10 years ago. My brother Clint had closed in on the professor. In the end, he exposed the man and put a stop to his lethal rampage. In the way only a man of my brother's caliber could. It's everything, is it? Poor father, he looks so troubled. Perhaps because 10 years ago something happened that's been weighing on his mind. Oh? I couldn't say were his words. That phrasing was very deliberate, I'm sure. I wonder if he's had his suspicions all these years. If that's the case, we need to use this cross-examination to prove what really happened, and remove any trace of doubt. We can establish that Kazuma-sama's claim of fabricated evidence was true. We can't shy away from this now, even if what we might uncover could lead to total calamity. Don't worry, Mr. Naruhodo, I'll be right here beside you, whatever may happen. Alright, well. There were no traces of injury. Then what about this ring? Objection! The court has heard that the ring was extracted from the victim's stomach. But you didn't actually see it being removed, did you, Professor Mikotoba? That's right. As I said in my testimony before, at that moment I was fetching a replacement scalpel that Dr. Wilson had requested. In other words, you can neither confirm nor deny whether the ring, in fact, really came from the victim's stomach or not. What are you suggesting, counsel? The ring was never in the victim's stomach to begin with. It's entirely feasible that Dr. Wilson fabricated that detail about the autopsy. What are you saying? That Dr. Wilson was in possession of the ring in advance after it was somehow stolen from Mr. Asogi. And he produced it during the procedure, pretending to have found it there and then in the victim's stomach. Objection! Supposition at best. What possible evidence do you have to support such a rash claim? This evidence right here. That's the autopsy report. It's explicit in that report, counsel. Other than the ring, nothing unusual was noted internally, so I'm not sure how you intend to prove your point. You've already done it for me, my lord. The lack of internal injury says it all. What? To swallow a ring of this size would require considerable effort and determination, and in addition to its size, there are the sharp claws around the gemstone to contend with. My brother was a determined man, and on the brink of death even more so, I'm sure. He would have stopped at nothing to ensure that the evil killer was brought to justice. But if he really had swallowed that enormous ring, it's inconceivable that no traces of its passage down his throat would have remained as internal trauma. Oh. And there you've arrived at the sticking point. That's precisely why I had my doubts about the findings myself 10 years ago. And why didn't you say something at the time? I did. I still remember the conversation I had with Dr. Wilson in the laboratory that day. Look at this. Now, this is a very curious thing to find in a man's stomach, wouldn't you say? But isn't that rather peculiar, Dr. Wilson? What's that now, Mikotoba? Well, if he swallowed a ring of that size with those sharp metal claws that it has, surely you'd expect to see damage to the throat and esophagus. Torn mucous membranes at the very least. Dr. Mikotaba, may I remind you that I have vastly more experience than you? I'm terribly sorry. I can think of plenty of ways to explain why no injuries would be seen. Now, let's say this. The victim would appear to have ingested the item as evidence to identify his assailant. Go ahead, write it down. So I was right. Dr. Wilson deliberately fabricated the results of the autopsy to implicate my father. I'm disappointed, Counsel. That argument is nothing more than speculation. What? Dr. Wilson was Britain's leading authority on forensic science and autopsy work. There is no scientific basis on which to doubt the man's expert opinion. Pardon the interruption, my lord, but damage to the mucous membranes of the throat is easily identified even in living subjects. Using a device called an endoscope, recently demonstrated in practical use in France. I want one. The government can pay. I don't think so. And, Dr. Gorey, rest assured that your removal of evidence from the stalls without permission will not go unpunished. We open up the dead to find the truth. I beg your pardon. But Mama, she chose to stitch your corpses up with all her secrets inside. That's wrong. Dr. Gorey, looks as though she's chosen to walk a different path to her Mama. Yes, the ring. What about the ring? I've just remembered something. An earlier incident. What incident? The one I recounted to you before, about a memory I have. Of Ginshi Nosogi saving my life. What? My father saved your life? It was 10 years ago, on a foggy night. Genshin and I were walking down some back streets at a late hour. All of a sudden... Don't make a leap, you're coming with us. Our assailants were armed with pistols, their faces obscured by scarves. The next thing I knew, there was silence all around. Genshin lay on the cobbled street. Blood was seeping from his left hand. He shielded me. It was on the ring finger of his left hand that he used to wear that ring. Are you saying... I've always believed those thugs were after me. But now I'm starting to question if perhaps I wasn't the intended target after all. But... Genshin was arrested 2 days after that attack. And in that short interval, decisive evidence needed to indict him was miraculously found. I mean, the ring was stolen from him. I think that's what those thugs were after that night.
Objection!
You pathetic coward. You expect me to believe that you weren't involved? What do you mean by that? It was you, wasn't it? You were the one who took it. You stole my father's ring. You set the whole thing up so you could paint him as a mass murderer and have him arrested. Kazuma, open your eyes. Ryunosuke, you must know deep down. The truth can be completely obscured even when your judgment is only slightly clouded. But at the moment, you seem to be floundering through a dense fog. Is that why you were so insistent I should be present in this trial? To see you like this? Well, this is an amusing spectacle. a grandiose expression on your face, as if you were Lady Justice herself. It seems you've thoroughly convinced yourself of this alleged fabrication of the autopsy results, so much so that you're apparently blind to the blatant contradiction that would be borne out of. What? Though it's extremely hard to believe, let us imagine that there was some misconduct during the autopsy. If that were the case, why would Asogi not have disputed the findings in his trial? In the closed court hearing 10 years ago, the defendant never once denied the claims against him. Isn't that right, Lord Van Zieks? Yes, that is indeed correct. Upon hearing the verdict of guilty, he merely closed his eyes, quietly accepting the judgment. The actions of a man who has accepted responsibility for his deeds and is resigned to his fate. But then... Oh my, that is very strange. Mr. Asogi did nothing to oppose the charges against him, then that would surely mean there was no fabricated evidence. An obvious conclusion at which you should have arrived many minutes ago, Prosecutor Asogi. Your twisted loyalty and clouded judgment are hampering your ability for logical thought. Genshin Asogi's silence at his hearing can only mean one thing. There was no fabrication of evidence during the autopsy of his final victim 10 years ago. But if that autopsy was all above board, there'll be nothing to stop Lord Strongheart bringing this trial to an immediate conclusion. Thank you, Ryunosuke. If it wasn't for your frank words just now, this trial may very well have ended prematurely. Kazuma? What's this latest absurdity, Counsel? My lord, your reasoning is perfectly sound, but for one giant hole. I beg your pardon. You claim my father's silence was due to the fact that there was no fabricated evidence, but there's another possible explanation. You've overlooked the possibility that he had a reason for maintaining that silence. Objection! Silence like that would lead him to be convicted and sent to his death? If the autopsy results were an invention, there's no conceivable reason why the man wouldn't have protested. That's a new pose for him. Objection! Oh, those results were an invention, all right. There's no question of that. Or are you forgetting that two people with a connection to that autopsy have been assassinated? If I force the grievances I feel from my mind, I start to see you in a very different light. I think perhaps it's you who's been living in delusion these 10 years. Me. Kazuma-sama has created one last chance for us here, Mr. Naruhodo, if we can only show there was a reason for his father's silence in his trial. Reason why the man would have said nothing, even though he was innocent. Could it have been part of some negotiation, perhaps? Enough rhetoric. The court must show evidence. What proof do you have that could possibly explain Asogi's silence in court? Doesn't say anything. Dismissal notice. He's relieved of his post, effective immediately for violating code of conduct, which was what again? All rights to redundancy pay. Aiding and abetting the escape from this prison of convict blank just prior to his execution. So wait a minute. Okay, so we've established that Asogi was the guy in the mask who escaped and was shot. And this is still... It's believed the convict engaged in some sort of negotiation. Well, okay, there we go. With prison staff in order to secure assistance. Full disclosure of information, okay. Well, it's probably that one then, huh? This is Gregson's autopsy report. Gregson. It's more Gregson stuff. I kind of wish you would get rid of some of these things, but I guess it's there to obscure it. Gregson. Has nothing to do with any of it. Last will and testament of Genshin Asogi. Mr. Vigil claims disappeared. The only weapon he has left. I hereby request upon my death all material possessions given to my son. With deep sadness I accept my fate in this foreign land. Okay. Well, that has nothing to do with it. I mean, it's another connection between him and Mr. Vigil. It's Gregson. That is not at all... I don't think we pulled that. Yeah, that's more Gregson stuff. Has nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Gregson stuff. Okay, it's gotta be this then.
Take that!
It's true that Genshin Asogi's silence during his trial resulted in his conviction. But that didn't actually lead to his execution. On the contrary. It led to his escape. An escape that was only possible because he'd been sentenced to death. Although I find it hard to believe my father would have negotiated in that way, the defense is correct. A fake execution, falsification of a death certificate, and a jailbreak inside a coffin. Clearly such an elaborate plan couldn't have been carried out by my father alone. He must have had the help of a collaborator from the judiciary. I have here the dismissal notice of the chief warder who was working in the prison at the time. The notes read, there are indications that the jailbreak was in planning prior to the inmate's incarceration. In other words, there were suggestions of some sort of negotiation between Mr. Asogi and the British government. In exchange for his silence in court, he was given an assurance that he would be broken out of prison. I see. So the off-screen gunshot that ended up killing him then would have only been possible by someone who knew that he had been negotiated to escape, i.e. the Reaper, i.e. Strongheart. Yes, with that sort of clandestine agreement in place, I can imagine he would have kept very quiet. I would go further than that, in fact. I would say that the elaborate jailbreak of Mr. Asogi can be explained in no other way. First fabricated evidence and now a jailbreak conspiracy. Of course, because it's all intimately linked. The prosecution wishes to summon new witnesses to the stand. Witnesses. People who can testify about the jailbreak that took place 10 years ago. Governor Caden. And the poor chief warder of the prison. I won't allow this trial to turn into a farce to summon the governor of the prison after all these years. Oh, it wouldn't be any trouble, my lord. What? Mother? My dear friend may appear a little rattle-pated at times, but I can assure you he is extremely thorough. He wired both Barclay and the local prison earlier. Asking Governor Caden and Mr. Vigil to attend the Old Bailey is a matter of extreme urgency. Mr. Sholmes did that? Are you telling me that both men are, unless I'm much mistaken, waiting just outside the courtroom at this very moment? My lord, you must permit this trial to proceed as you declared it at its outset. You promised that we would stop at nothing to uncover the whole truth behind these disturbing findings. Very well. Bring in the witnesses. Make no mistake, I too would like nothing more than to lay this business to rest once and for all. All right. The new witnesses state their names and occupations for the court. We'll do this next time. See you then.